Hey there, welcome back. It's great to see you again. It is Monday, January 8th, and today we're going to talk about the importance of neuroscience in intergenerational trauma therapy. And this is week 2 of the 2024 Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Immersion Calendar, where we're doing a year-long deep survey into intergenerational trauma and all the aspects that are important to touch on when you're developing a foundation to consider maybe getting a specialization in this type of therapy. So, what we will talk about today, we're going to talk about 7 main areas, and that includes neuroplasticity. So, that's how the brain kind of shifts and changes and different pathways can be made. We're going to look at epigenetics, which is how trauma is passed down genetically, look at emotion regulation, brain adaptations, and effective brain mechanisms and effective adaptations, decision making and self-regulation, early attachments, and the stress response system. So we're going to start with neuroplasticity. And basically, neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to grow new pathways and make new connections at any point in the lifespan. So there's times where developmentally we're at a more ready state to develop these pathways, including certain times in utero, 0 to 4 years old after being born, and then in adolescence there's just an explosion of growth and development, and that neuroplasticity becomes really important during the whole lifespan, but it's very important with people who have experienced trauma, and especially intergenerational trauma. So the thing that neuroplasticity does for people who've experienced intergenerational trauma is it offers hope, because we feel like we get ingrained in these patterns. There's no way to change it. We're always going to have the same thing happening, and it'll never be any different because of how our brains work, and that's just who we are. But neuroplasticity gives us a mechanism to change those automatic responses and some of the ways that we've adapted to our environment to make some healthy new connections. So the whole foundation of trauma therapy and intergenerational trauma therapy is really rooted in neuroplasticity. So it's about creating new pathways in the brain. And it can be difficult due to the biological wiring of attachment and survival drives. So we're not dealing with something that's kind of an add-on or a plus. This is a survival drive, and so it's biologically wired, and it's very strong drive. So it can be difficult, but hope isn't lost. Neuroplasticity is what brings us that hope. So the interventions that leverage neuroplasticity really well are generally those interventions that are more deeper brain, or they work down in kind of the limbic system, the memory system, and they help regulate some of the responses to different stimuli that we experience that might be traumatic reminders. So my favorite one is polyvagal intervention. So that helps a person regulate their autonomic nervous system. So they recognize if they're in kind of a fight, flight, freeze, or a connection state. It also helps them learn how they can get to a connection state when they're in one of the fight or flight or freeze states. Attachment-based interventions, another favorite, is those are important because attachment is really the mechanism that transmits intergenerational trauma. And it's also a biological drive, and it's based in the brain and affects the behavior of the child and the adult. The next one is relational neuroscience or interpersonal neurobiology. So this looks at different integration in the brain of like left and right hemisphere, top and bottom functioning of the brain, and different kind of integrating the story, integrating relationships, integrating kind of the meaning of life or spirituality. So that's another really important one for neuroplasticity. And then the other thing is just addressing those developmental impacts whether you're working with a child who is being impacted by intergenerational trauma or you're working with the adult, because those developmental impacts are what become complex trauma in an adult or what transmits that intergenerational trauma to a child or within the child. So that's neuroplasticity. Now we're going to move on to epigenetics. And epigenetics is really important to understand, but it's not an area that we have direct influence over and that we can manipulate or change. That's not what we do as therapists. And it's a really complex area, but it's very good to know about epigenetics. So epigenetics is really about changes in genes or genetic markers based on environmental impacts. So I look at these as being like red flags for future adversity, that there's genetic markers when one person in it, generation one, goes through a traumatic event, like the Dutch famine, the Holocaust, all those big events, there will be red flags kind of put on certain markers that are beneficial for survival later on if another generation encounters similar experiences. So it's kind of like an antenna that kind of looks for things in the environment, and once that experience is there and that antenna kind of resonates, then that gene can be kind of kicked into action, which can cause all kinds of different things. So there was the Dutch famine. I'm not that familiar with it, but I've read a little bit about it. That was a time where it was a famine, and they had really, really solid, good medical records for everybody involved in that. So they were able to watch different medical illnesses, mental health. They were able to watch everything, and they documented it really well. So that's one of the events that a lot of geneticists look back on when we're looking at epigenetics. So basically, epigenetics is a sensitivity to environmental events that will trigger gene expression. So some cultures and communities will refer to these as blood memories, and there's sometimes some spiritual beliefs around the way that things from one generation get transmitted to another generation. But you'll see this idea throughout cultures, even if they don't know about genetics. So it becomes very important. So as therapists, we can't intervene at a genetic level. But what we can do is we can use this information to support the need for intervention and support motivation to move forward and make changes so that it stops that transmission through the epigenetic route. But we can also use it to normalize the impacts that a family's been through. So if there's health consequences of a second or third generation, they may interpret that as I'm not doing what I should, I don't take care of myself, I'm lazy, whatever those self-thoughts would be. But it may actually be something genetic, which then we can kind of reframe it away from self-judgment. So that's a really important use of epigenetics as therapists. Our next area is emotion regulation and how intergenerational trauma impacts that. So this is one of the main developmental impacts of having developmental trauma. So there's huge emotional regulation challenges. They can kind of range from high reactivity, so that's being very reactive, hair trigger for a reaction of fight, flight, or freeze, or they can be kind of shut down and they don't respond anymore. So a person who's shut down would walk through a really dangerous environment and not even have a reaction because it's just kind of the norm, and their nervous system has dampened down all of those kind of fight and flight responses. So trauma responses, whether they're reactive, whether they're shut down, they're adaptive at the moment. So they're adaptive in nature and they're rooted in survival. So we don't want to get rid of these, and we don't want to look at them as negative or bad, but we also don't want to get stuck. So there's no responses that are bad, but over time, then they can create new difficulties when we no longer need them and they're no longer useful. So trauma responses can create a lot of difficulties with emotion regulation, and it really comes down to the autonomic reactivity and responses in the present moment. So what you can see when there's a lot of trauma in their history, the autonomic responses may create faulty neuroception. And basically, faulty neuroception is the detection of threat or danger when there really isn't any there. So this would be somebody in a grocery store asking if you could move so they could get an item, and the person freaks out. So that is faulty neuroception causes those emotional reactions. And then they can have difficulties during critical periods for developing those brain pathways for emotion regulation. So that's another way that there's interference with the development of emotion regulation. And there's several critical periods that can be impacted. One is the third trimester. The mother's level of stress can impact the exposure to cortisol. And that's a developmental time where that system for emotion regulation is developing. So if they're exposed to a lot of cortisol, there's outcomes that are linked to that. So when we look at those times, there's the third trimester, and then really 0 to 48 months, the first 4 years of life, there's a lot of development that becomes really important. And that's a rapid time of brain development. And there's a couple specific circuits that develop during a very narrow window of time that if there's a lot of disruption and trauma impacts during that time, it causes those circuits to be weaker and less effective. So then you'll see emotion regulation and behavior problems later on. So the strategies that we can help people develop better emotion regulation, I really think autonomic regulation is the foundation of that emotional regulation, especially when it involves co-regulation, and especially for people who've been impacted by intergenerational trauma, because it's that attachment disruption that continues that transmission. So if we can improve autonomic regulation, if they have accurate neuroception, they can detect a threat, they can kind of screen things out that aren't a threat, they're not dampened down, so they have an appropriate level of reactivity and it's accurate, we can improve their emotion regulation because they're not going to have as much biological or chemical drive behind those emotions that create those really large responses. And due to the developmental periods that we're dealing with children and teens, we may need some additional strategies to help. And those are particularly attachment-based strategies. We want to address those attachment impacts and have that relationship become a container to help support that emotion regulation and development of those pathways. We may also, depending on the impact on the developmental domains of intergenerational trauma and developmental trauma, you may need to develop some sensory strategies that are beneficial and don't overwhelm the person, but also help them feel soothed and calm. You may have to use different interventions that use active behavior or are less reliant on language, because all of those impacts where they're on cognition, attachment, neurobiology, physical development, all of those are areas that we could kind of target in order to support meeting those developmental needs and pushing back on those impacts. So our fourth area is to look at the brain mechanisms and effective adaptations. So the brain adapts beautifully to trauma, and it helps keep us alive. It helps us survive that event or events. However, it can cause problems later on. And Daniel Siegel talk about what fires together wires together, and that's really your neuroplasticity. So whatever things happen in the brain in kind of the same time or the same patterns, those will kind of get wired together and they can become really strong. So this is where child development becomes really important, because during childhood, connections totally flourish, but it's almost like being in the dense brush of a forest where there's all these connections, there's a lot of brush on the ground, where it's really hard to really see what pathways are there. But when they hit adolescence around 11 or 12, there's a process where the the pathways that aren't really used are kind of pruned back because they're not as strong. So those are pruned back, and the ones that are laid down really accelerate. So it's a time of really rapid acceleration of brain development. That's where you see some of the odd behaviors that teenagers can sometimes have, or that experience that parents have, that it's like they wake up one day and they don't know who their child is because they're all of a sudden they've, I don't know, dyed their hair black and are wearing black nail polish, or they're totally different. And it seems like it happens overnight, but it's that development of those pathways, the pruning and the flourishing. So this is also important because this is where mental health vulnerability comes in. If you have a child that has been kind of not as popular, not as engaged, kind of self-conscious, um, that ends up developing some negative thoughts about themselves. When they hit that pruning, the things that are maybe not as frequently heard of, you're a good kid, people love you, that can get pruned back in their kind of the relational circuits. And then these other circuits take over. So they may become countercultural. They may get into drugs or alcohol. They may kind of take off and run away from the family. So that's those vulnerabilities that we have to be really careful of during adolescence, especially when there's been a lot of trauma. So I look at adaptations in 3 different levels. I look at it as the autonomic adaptations. So that's your autonomic nervous system, your stress response, your fight, flight, freeze. Attachment adaptations, because it impacts relationships. And then the behavioral adaptations or patterns that you'll see when you have these autonomic adaptations and relational or attachment adaptations. So the autonomic adaptations can be either amplified or dampened reactivity. So they can be highly reactive to things that really don't require that level of reactivity, or they can just not react at all. So these are adaptations to threat, and they're very important at the time of the threat. It's healthy under those threatening conditions, but it's no longer healthy when the threat is no longer there. So this can lead to that desensitization or faulty neuroception. And then when you look at attachment in relationship to their autonomic adaptations, you'll see different attachment strategies that develop that, again, they're very brilliant, they're very adaptive, they're very, at the time they develop, the strategies are needed, but they can cause problems later on. So those attachment strategies include being secure. You can be away from somebody, see them again, and everything's good. You can be anxious and preoccupied with somebody that you care about or a parent. You can be avoidant, where you just don't connect and are kind of aloof or reserved. Or there's the one disorganized that is actually very organized, but it just doesn't have a solution, is one that there's a lot of fear of a caregiver or a partner, but also a very high need for that caregiver or partner. So there's a conflict. That's where the disorganization comes in, but it's actually a very adaptive way to handle dangerous relationships, especially as an infant or child. So when you have the autonomic adaptations, the attachment adaptations, then you'll see relational adaptations and behavioral adaptations. And you'll see relationship patterns that develop out of the autonomic reactivity or dampen down and the attachment strategies. So some of these you'll see like pleasing and appeasing, and some people will call this fawning, but I don't use that term. For one, Dr. Porges refers to it as pleasing and appeasing and puts fawn as a different response. And when you're working with this autonomic reactivity and the autonomic regulation, you need to know what pathway you're working with so that you can effectively intervene. And if you throw something in that, like fawning, that really isn't one of these primary states, it can make it much harder. Including it as a mixed state is totally different, but that's beyond this discussion. So you'll see pleasing and appeasing, where the person will be anxious in a relationship and they'll manage that by doing anything the person wants and anything that they want to do, so that they can kind of be secure in that relationship. But what happens is the person ends up not having their needs met in the relationship. They can become resentful, and they can end up doing things that they normally wouldn't do or they don't agree with. So it puts them in a real state of conflict. There can be collapsing and shutting down, where they're so removed, there's no kind of engagement. It's almost like the symptom of anhedonia with depression, where it's just flat and they just don't come out of their shell at all. And it's really hard to connect with them. It's a protective response that works at the time that it developed, but it's no longer useful when those relationship or trauma experiences are no longer there. And another one that I find a lot in kids who have been impacted by intergenerational trauma is this wicked sense of competition. And it's not competition in sports and I did the best, or I came in first. It's I have got to be first in line. I've got to have the best of everything. So they may steal things from other people. They want to have the most of something. They want to be liked the most. So it's this sense of competition, and that comes from a place of insecurity, but it can create a lot of relational problems, especially with peers in school and with siblings. So those are just some of those relational and behavioral adaptations that come out of the autonomic adaptations and the attachment adaptations. So how can understanding this support our interventions in therapy? Well, we need to recognize that these relational adaptations are significant, and we have to recognize them in intergenerational trauma therapy because they're very common, and you'll find them everywhere when you're working with intergenerational trauma. And it's a mechanism for transmission between generations. So this is where we need to stick that wedge so that it no longer transmits down to the next generation. So those behavioral patterns that continue the impacts of trauma, they kind of set situations up to repeat the same type of trauma. And they result in further traumatic impacts. So a child that has a high sense of competition, they may have needed that in a situation of neglect or a kind of favoritism among kids where there's significant abuse if you're not the favorite child. So there's that competition that develops, but that can create more relational distress. It can create more trauma related to the outcome of that behavior. So those are really important to know. There's several of them. I can only go into a few of them for this video, but they're very important to know and recognize, and it helps you really understand this is likely what is causing this from their developmental impacts and their trauma history. So now we're going to look at decision-making, self-regulation, and how intergenerational trauma impacts that. So one of the domains that intergenerational trauma impacts is cognition and cognitive development. So because the brain in a traumatic situation, the brain is very hijacked, the higher cortex in thinking, like reasoning, planning, problem solving, learning language, those all get shut down to favor survival and that kind of limbic response, and having those survival mechanisms available to the person rather than thinking about learning a language. So these are very important, and they're going to really impact what you do in therapy and how you do it. Because sometimes if there's cognitive impacts where language is disrupted, you're going to have to use language and maybe hands-on interventions that the child or the parent can understand and work with. You may have to use different ways, like hands-on things, sand tray, because they're going to have difficulties if you're not on the same kind of level. And it's not an intelligence thing. It's a brain function in the cognitive areas of the brain. So environmental learning from family and parents, they may not be exposed to language. If there's a lot of intergenerational trauma, the parents really shut down, they don't interact much, there's not a lot of exposure to language. Language may be kind of challenged for a child that comes from that environment. So there can be environmental learning, and it can also be the cognitive functioning, where we see the impacts where they're less likely to have that energy going to the cognitive structures, and then they don't develop those pathways. But we can alter that, and we can help that through therapy. So self-regulation is impacted due to those disruptions in attachment and co-regulation. So self-regulation always comes out of relationship and co-regulation. That's where we learn how to self-regulate, is having a caring person kind of come and help us feel safe and connected, and they help pull us back into that autonomic state. So if a person has greater autonomic reactivity and emotional reactivity, you'll see a lot of hypervigilance. They'll startle very easy. They'll be very hypervigilant to what people say, who's in the room. They'll want to know information that may not be appropriate for their generation or for children to know, but they get demanding because they're hypervigilant and they feel like they have to know everything in order to find a space of safety. Their reactivity can be really high, so they can have a lot of dysregulation. So their autonomic nervous system and emotional responses are pretty reactive, and they can be that fight or flight, or they can be shut down and disconnected. And that's kind of that dampening or the freeze or dissociation pathway that can also be there. So that self-regulation is totally impacted by that autonomic reactivity, and it's developed through co-regulation and relationship. So for kids who are impacted by developmental trauma and adults who are impacted as well with complex trauma, and they're both impacted by intergenerational trauma, problem solving may be really difficult because those higher cortical structures are hijacked in favor of survival. That's adaptive. They need that response, but only if there truly is a threat. So their reactivity may be highly sensitized or highly desensitized. But both of these impacts have an effect on their ability to self-regulate and problem solve. So autonomic state awareness is the first step in state regulation. So a person needs to know where their autonomic state is and how to get back to a sense of comfort, safety, connection. And co-regulation in therapy sessions is one of the most effective tools for helping them develop that self-regulation and that self-awareness. With kids, I do it more with like my sand tray miniatures, and animals are wonderful for that. So they may pull like a tiger for the fight. They may pull like a meerkat for their flight. And they may pick like a possum or a sloth for their kind of freeze or shutdown mode. And then we just kind of work on what state were you in? How did the sloth react when that happened? Or what did the tiger do when your brother or sister took your game away from you? So we work it in a playful way to help them understand more about their reactivity. So we also want to improve that cycle of neuroception to be accurate and adaptive. So we want to decrease the overamplification, so that faulty neuroception, that high reactivity, but we also want to increase adaptive and accurate neuroception so that they can truly detect threat and they can react to it when necessary. When there's greater regulation and at the moment and overall kind of in life, then cognitive strategies are much more effective. The cognitive behavioral therapy for kids who are highly reactive and constantly having that emotional and relational reactivity, cognitive interventions really, they don't work for them until you can kind of down regulate all those adaptive but faulty responses. So now we're going to look at early attachments, brain development, and trauma responses. So there is a relationship between all of these components, and early attachment disruptions are the main mechanism for transmission of intergenerational trauma. So that's the main target that we want to hit in therapy, so that it changes that and transforms, so that trauma is no longer transmitted to the next generation, and the current generation of child or teen can start a healing process. So these early attachment disruptions have a huge impact on the emotion regulation during specific developmental periods. So it's really important to know these developmental periods because it has negative impacts on their emotion regulation later in life. So when we have clients that we think are impacted by intergenerational trauma, or a child who is definitely impacted by trauma and attachment disruptions, we do an in-depth developmental assessment, and we ask specifically about these different periods of time. What was happening in the child's life? What was happening for the mom? Were there any significant events in the first 3 to 4 years of life? Because that will help us kind of map out what may be the roots, or what may be causing the current behavior that we're seeing. So early developmental trauma. So developmental trauma is more closely linked with dissociation in children and later as adults. And this is really important because dissociation can have a huge impact on a person's relationships, their daily functioning, their ability to work. So there's huge impacts on the person themselves, their relationships, and their life in general. So they may also cause significant disruptions in experience. So they may have gaps in awareness or knowledge. They may not remember things. They may not be able to kind of put things together. It's like your memory becomes like Swiss cheese. Some things come through and are stored, and some things don't. And it can also explain unexplained emotional reactivity. So if a child or an adult gets extremely upset about something that is really kind of not matching up, and the other people around them are kind of like, why is that reaction so big? It can be that emotional reactivity, but it's linked to implicit trauma and implicit memory. So they don't have a conscious memory of it, because during 0 to 3 or 4, they don't have language to encode the memory, but their body remembers it. So it's important to kind of track that developmental process and see if you can identify where some of those impacts may be. So the last area we're going to look at is how intergenerational trauma impacts the stress response system. And basically, the stress response system is really your autonomic nervous system, all the hormones and body chemicals that go along with that. And research has shown that in the third trimester, the mother's stress response system directly impacts the child's stress response system through cortisol. So if the mother is experiencing extreme stress during the last trimester, her cortisol is likely high, and that's going to sensitize the child's system to cortisol. So the exposure to those high levels of cortisol in that third trimester, they're actually associated with behavioral problems and stress related diseases later in life in adulthood. So I always ask, if I'm working with a parent child dyad or if I'm working with just a child, I always ask if there's any knowledge about that third trimester and the degree of stress the mother may have been under, because there's a emotion regulation circuit that develops during that time that the cortisol creates a weakening of those connections. So that sensitization of the stress response system will result in faulty neuroception. So that's the detection of threat when there really isn't any threat there. Increased reactivity. So the responses become much more extreme. They become much bigger than they would have had they not had that sensitization. And there's also physical health implications. So you can develop adrenal fatigue. This is where fibromyalgia comes in. It can impact heart health. It increases inflammation in the body. So it's really important to regulate that stress response system and help kind of reverse those effects. So the present neuroscience-based approaches that help manage these effects for therapists would be polyvagal interventions. Again, it's that autonomic stress response system regulation and co-regulation that can help have more accurate detection of threat and less reactivity or less shutdown. And brain spotting and EMDR are interventions that can kind of clear out some of those implicit things. They can kind of break the strength of that neural network or pathway in a positive way so they don't have that reactivity. Somatic experiencing is also a wonderful intervention because a lot of our autonomic reactivity, the first thing that we'll notice is some kind of somatic experience when we've had a shift in our neuroception. So having those somatic experiencing interventions are also important. There's tons of interventions that it's hard to list all of those, but those are the primary ones that either I use or that I would recommend. So to recap, we've talked about neuroplasticity, epigenetics, motion regulation, brain mechanisms and effective adaptations, decision-making and self-regulation, early attachments, and that stress response system. And those are the primary areas that neuroscience is really important when you're working with intergenerational trauma. So next week, we're going to have an overview of complex trauma in adults, and we'll look at how that develops through intergenerational trauma and what it looks like in the therapy room. So thank you for coming and thank you for listening, and I hope you have a beautiful day.